Hello, greetings from India. This is Hippu Salk. I work as a faculty in the Institute of Rural Management, Anand. Uh, Welcome you all to this first online version of the Human Development and Capability Association conference. I'm going to present a paper in front of all of you that is titled Substitutes and Complements, Curious Case of Poverty Measure. When you talk of any measurement exercise or any indicator development, we face with the dilemma between among the various measures which we have to decide which is the better measure. The process in which we follow to arrive at the better measure is basically two steps. In the first step, we outline the desirable properties of the measure, and in the second step, we basically see among the competing measures which is the measure which is able to satisfy most of the properties. And the measure which would be satisfying properties in a better way or more number of properties in a desirable way, we call that measure to be a superior measure or a better measure, and that measure perhaps goes on to replace the earlier measure. But the question which we face most of the time in indicator research is the following: is a better measure always more successful or more acceptable measure? The answer to this is actually it happens quite a few number of times, but not always. Success of a measure actually depends on a lot of other factors, starting from the simplicity of the measure to the politics of it. So, this is a trend which you have seen in all measures. So this is the current paper which I am basically in a working paper stage, where I am looking at the poverty measures, and poverty measures are not an exception to this trend that the best measures are not always the most successful measure. Well, the very good example to start with in poverty measure is the most crude measure, or we call it the most basic measure, that is the head count ratio. So there is very good aspects of head count ratio. Head count ratio is a simple measure, and for some of you who are not aware about the term head count ratio is nothing but basically it's a ratio of the people who are poor vis-a-vis the total number of people. So obviously it is that sense a normalized measure, and it is recognized in fact as the first measure of poverty. So in that sense it is very straightforward. But if you look at the bad part of it, because once you categorize people as poor and non-poor, then you are basically treating all the poor equally irrespective of their level of poverty. So in that sense, it has a very homogeneous approach in terms of treatment towards poor, and in this sense is basically misrepresents poverty. And of course, the ugly part of the head count ratio, if I can put it, basically the concept or the notion behind the poverty line itself, that there is a magical line and which can actually divide the population into poor and non-poor, in the sense if you fall below that income line, then you are considered as poor, and if you are above that income line, you are considered as non-poor. I mean, this is that discrete nature of poverty line which is ingrained in the concept of head count ratio. So why it is an ugly part? Because I mean, this has been highlighted by quite a few researchers. To my knowledge, almost 5 decades ago, Watts sort of presented it in one of his papers, that poverty is not really a discrete condition. I mean, one doesn't immediately acquire set affliction we associate with poverty by crossing certain line or certain income level. More or less, I mean, what basically Watts is trying to convey here, that it's poverty actually has a sense of graduality, or it's a sense of continuity. So income is not like, for example, access to job. I mean, somebody is employed, not employed. So that is a discrete condition. Somebody has a connection to electricity and not connected to electricity. In that sense, that also has a discrete condition. But income, which actually can gradually increase or gradually decrease, it is not discrete in that sense. So if we see whether this, if I put it, badness of head count ratio has been highlighted in the poverty literature or not, of course if we actually pit head count ratio with the desirable axioms or the desirable properties any poverty measure should satisfy, headcount ratio would squarely fail in some of the basic axioms. For example, the continuity axiom, which basically says that a small change in poor person's income should not lead to a huge jump in poverty level. But in headcount ratio case, it might happen. You imagine a hypothetical society where maybe 50% of the population are marginally below the poverty line, and a small increase in their income actually make them go above the poverty line. And that sense, the headcount ratio will suddenly fall from 0.5 to 0. So in that sense, it will not satisfy the continuity axiom. Also, it will not satisfy the monotonicity axiom, which basically clearly says that a decrease in the poor person's income should actually have an increase in poverty. I mean, that is quite straightforward. And the headcount ratio would not satisfy that because it doesn't sort of account for the level of poverty. Whether suppose the poverty line is suppose 10 units of monetary value, and suppose somebody is at 9 units of monetary value vis-a-vis somebody has 1 unit of monetary value, or the person's income actually falls from 9 units to 1 unit, the headcount ratio would not be able to capture that. So in that sense, it actually would also fail in the monotonicity axiom. So, but the more surprising thing is, though headcount ratio has failed, I mean, fails in some of these axioms, some of these desirable or the basic properties of poverty measure, but HCR still remains till date as the most widely used poverty measure. And this is not that it is measured in one society or one country, it is worldwide. I mean, countries invariably have their national poverty line, and they report and measure and report the national poverty year by year on the basis of headcount ratio. World Bank uses international poverty line. Currently, it is $1.9 per capita income in purchasing power parity terms. I mean, in fact, the attention, the international attention to the headcount ratio is very emphatic. I mean, that is quite evident from if you look at the very first target of Millennium Development Goal or the Sustainable Development Goals, which have replaced MDGs. I mean, the very first indicator of the very first target of the very first goal, I mean, which is basically the first goal, it basically talks about reducing poverty. It actually talks about headcount ratio. I mean, for instance, for the Millennium Development Goal, it basically says half between 1990 to 2015, the proportion people whose income is less than $1.25 a day. Similarly, the SDG's first indicator of the first target, first goals, first targets, first indicator is eradicate extreme poverty for all people everywhere, currently measured as people living on less than $1.25 a day. So this is the problem, in the sense the headcount ratio, we in the poverty literature, the scholars, the policymakers, the researchers, all of them know that it is the crudest measure, it's the simplest measure, it has quite a few limitations, but still it actually rules the world in terms of its popularity, not only among larger section of the people, but also among policymakers and planners. So now the question obviously would come, I mean, HCR remains as the headline indicator. Is it because there is a dearth of a better indicator of poverty in literature? Actually, that is not true as well. I mean, poverty literature itself, I mean, particularly the indicator exercise, if we go back to 1976 seminal paper by Sen, where he actually does axiomatic treatment of the poverty. Henceforth, there are quite a few scholars who have come out with variety of poverty measures. And in literature, actually, there is no dearth. I mean, if you look at one of the seminal papers by Zheng in 1997, he actually does a very robust review of aggregate poverty measure in the literature, and in that paper, he basically outlines the 17 desirable properties a poverty measure should satisfy. And if we see, among the, so he basically categorizes the properties from the simple properties to more sort of advanced properties, if I can put it. So according to his classification, the class 3, I mean, he basically classifies the measures also, those which satisfies the basic properties only and fails in most of the properties, and those indicators which satisfy the, for example, distribution sensitive and subgroup consistent property, which are basically the most advanced measures. So that basically satisfy all these measures, which satisfy the distribution sensitive and subgroup consistent measure, that is the class 3 measure. They basically satisfy all the 17 desirable properties. I mean, there are quite a few measures of that kind that actually falls into the class 3 category. But though there are actually such measures are available in literature, but the superior measures, the superior indicators, though they are in knowledge in the last 3 to 5 decades among the policymakers and researchers, none could actually capture the imagination the way the headcount ratio has actually captured the imagination of the public at large as well as the policymakers. So we can very well say the headcount ratio has remained as the undisputed headline indicator till date. So this is basically the table I was referring to, the Jenks paper of 1997. As you can see in this table, on the first column, the properties are basically outlined, the names of the properties, of the names of the axioms, and there were class 0, class 1, class 2, class 3 measures. As you can see, all the class 3 measures are all tick. That basically signify that all these measures are satisfying all the desirable properties a poverty measure should have. So in that sense, there is no dearth of good measures in poverty. But the point I am making here is, but in spite of there is no dearth of good measures, the headcount ratio, which is the very first class 0 measure in this table, actually which fails in quite a few properties as you can see here, but still it actually remains as the headline indicator. Now, what I am trying to posit here is that the part of the problem actually lies with the approach we follow in case of poverty measure. In fact, this approach we follow in all measures. I mean, as I said in the beginning of the presentation, the approach we follow is basically there are 2 steps. The step 1 basically would outline the desirable properties, and the step 2 would see, between the 2 measures, suppose competing measures, which one is satisfying the properties in a better way. So this approach is basically, it's trying to substitute an inferior measure with a superior measure. So the effort to substitute one measure actually with another measure is not probably the most desirable way, because in this process we sort of not consider the complementarity among the measures. So we discount that there may be natural complementarity among the indicators, so that complementarity is never explored. So the template which is followed in case of every indicator exercise actually almost remains the same, that the same approach, and poverty measures also follow the same process. I mean, for an example, if we see there is one measure which is in poverty, which is called income gap ratio. So some of you also might know income gap ratio is basically that will calculate the sum of the gaps of the poor people from the income poverty line, and then that gap will be divided by the number of poor people. So this is different from poverty gap ratio, which is actually the numerator remains the same in the poverty gap ratio, but the denominator there becomes the total population. Whereas in this case, the denominator becomes the only the poor people. So the income gap ratio actually, in that sense, tells about the average level of poverty of the poor. So in this sense, it is naturally complementing the headcount ratio, because headcount ratio is saying what proportion of the population is poor, and income gap ratio is saying how much poor the poor are, or what is the level of poverty of the poor. So in that sense, they are complementary, and that complementarity has been acknowledged by Sen in a couple of his work, where he actually says it is natural to think that the two must complement each other since they address different aspects of poverty. But unfortunately, I mean, all researchers, including Sen, didn't resist the temptation of actually replacing the inferior measure with a better measure. Actually, they basically went ahead with this substitution approach, and that we are basically saying here has caused the problem. So in this paper, what I'm trying to do is I'm basically trying to propose that poverty measures, there should be two different sets of poverty measures which are complementary to each other. So one set of poverty measure is for the entire population, and the other set of poverty measure is actually meant for only the poor people. So the first one I'm saying as the original one or the existing one, which is like conventional approach, and the second one is basically the complementary poverty measure. So what I have done next is I have actually gone through all the desirable properties of poverty measure, and I have divided those desirable properties of the axioms into three categories. First are the axioms, those which require modification to be applicable for the complementary poverty measure. And the second set of axioms are those axioms which require no modification other than the scope change. In the sense, if the original axiom is talking about such and such things should be valid for the entire population, for the complementary poverty measure would say that such and such thing, the same thing should be valid for only the poor people. Whereas the third set of axiom are the axioms which can be used as verbatim, and that they are basically can be used as it is. So basically in the first category we have four such axioms. So the first axiom, which is in fact the you can say the reason for which the concept of poverty line or the notion of poverty line it get ingrained in this axiom. This axiom actually in next four slides I will be basically presenting the existing axiom and the modified axiom which we are basically proposing for the complementary poverty measure. And in all these four slides, you would find one particular phrase underlined. So that phrase actually corresponds to the original axiom. So originally, this particular axiom is known as focus axiom. Focus axiom basically says a poverty measure is independent of the income distribution of non-poor. Quite fair, because if the income changes or the income level of the non-poor changes, the poverty value should not change. But in the complementary measure, which is concerning with the poverty of the poor, actually this focus axiom needs to be stronger, in the sense it should say a complementary poverty measure is independent of non-poor. It is not only about the income distribution of the non-poor, it is also about the non-poor themselves, which otherwise means if non-poor gets added to the population or migrated out of the society, whether it is in-migration of non-poor or out-migration of non-poor, the poverty of the poor has not changed. So in that sense, the complementary poverty measure value should not change. So in that sense, the strong focus axiom would read as a complementary poverty measure is independent of non-poor. I mean, this axiom was first, to my knowledge, has been reported by Subramanian in one of his papers in 2002, and this has a different name in Paxton's work. It is called poverty non-variance axiom. It is also Haswan and Subramanian in 2010 paper reported this as population focus axiom. But the point the authors have also mentioned that it has not got the due attention. And so in that sense, for a complementary poverty measure, we would replace the conventional focus axiom with the strong focus axiom. So similarly, the next conventional axiom is the strong monotonicity axiom, which would basically says that if the income of the poor increases, then the poverty should fall. But here we will have to introduce a restriction, because the income of the poor increases, but the poor doesn't cross the poverty line. So in that sense, we will say a complementary poverty measure to decrease with increase in poor person's income, but the poor person is not crossing the poverty line. Why we are bringing in that restriction in this axiom is because once the poor crosses the poverty line, so the poverty of the poor basically are to do with the people who are left in poverty, and that poverty of the poor would increase or decrease compared to the previous situation depending upon the person's whose increment of income the person has left poverty. That person's original income was higher or lower than the average income of the left out poor would basically decide whether the left out poor's poverty would increase or decrease. I mean, this is basically this is not very difficult to imagine. For instance, if you have a 10 unit value of 10 unit value of money at the poverty line, and if somebody and for example on an average, suppose people have poor people have 5 unit value of money on an average, and if the increment of of income has happened for a person who has 2 unit value of money, and that 2 unit person actually got a lottery or something, and he or she becomes non-poor, then obviously the left out people's average condition improves, because that person who had 2 units of money, which is lower than the average, has left. Whereas if the person who got the lottery is above 5 units value of money, if that person actually has crossed the poverty line with the increment of income, then obviously the poverty value of the left out population is actually worsens. So in that sense, that restriction is required. So a complementary poverty measure, the axiom would be called as restricted strong monopsony axiom, and which would be read as a complementary poverty measure to decrease with increase in poor person's income, but with the restriction that the increment doesn't lift the poor out of poverty. So there is a poverty growth axiom in the conventional measure. So the poverty growth axiom in the conventional measure would say, if a poor joins the society, then poverty should increase. Obviously, a poverty measure which concerns only about the poverty of the poor, we need to know the person who is joining the poor, the person, whether he or she had a poverty level which is more or less than the average level of the poverty level of the people who she is or he is joining. So this is again quite straightforward. It's like simple way one can express. I mean, if a new student joins a class, the average height of the class will increase depending upon whether the new student joining has a height more than the average height of the class. So something similar. So where we are saying, so if the the person who is basically getting added, the poor person who is getting added to the society, if that person has a higher level of poverty compared to the average level of poverty of the existing population, the poverty would worsen. If that person has a lower level of poverty, the poverty situation would improve. So in that sense, it is a reversible poverty growth axiom. So we cannot straight away say poor joining the society, the poverty would increase. And the last one is basically in this set is the conventional axiom is increase in poverty line. So which is for the complementary poverty measure, it would be restricted increase in poverty line. So increase in poverty line axiom is again very straightforward. It basically says if the poverty line increases, obviously the poverty value would increase. But here what we are saying is the axiom is valid, the poverty line increases, the poverty value should increase, but then we are also putting a restriction that with the increase of poverty line, there is no new entrant who is becoming from non-poor to the poor. I mean, there is no new entry into the poverty because of this increase of poverty line. Why we are putting this restriction? Because once a new person who is marginally above the poverty line, and because of this increase in poverty line, now he or she has come into poverty now. So then there are basically two effects to the average level of the poverty of the population. One effect is because of the increase of poverty line, the poverty value should increase because now the poverty gaps are more and people will be relatively at a larger depth than the poverty line. But then there is a relatively richer person who has joined the poor people, because now the person's income who is now just below falling below the poverty line, who has basically come below the poverty line because of this increase, he or she would be relatively richer compared to the existing poor. So in that sense, that would try to decrease the value of poverty. So there is two opposing effects here happening, and the net effect will basically result the exact value of whether the complementary poverty measure should increase or decrease. So in that sense, this axiom is a restricted increasing poverty line axiom with this particular restriction. So now the second set of axiom is basically again very straightforward. So in the sense, these axioms are same as the poverty measure axioms, like replication invariant axiom, which basically says the population replicate, the poverty measure should not change. We would say not the population replicate, but the complementary poverty measure, we would say if the poor people replicate, the poverty measure should not change. Similarly, the symmetric axiom, which doesn't, the population names should not, the people's names should not matter. Similarly, we will say poor people's names should not matter. The subgroup consistency axiom, which is in the conventional sense, the subgroup of population, it should be, if the one subgroup population's poverty increases with all other subgroups poverty remaining the same, the entire poverty should increase. Here we would say that for the complementary poverty measure, that the complementary poverty of the poor people, if that subgroup of poor people, one subgroup of poor people increases, then and everything remaining, every other poor people's subgroup of poor people's complementary measure of poverty remaining the same, the overall complementary measure of poverty should increase. So, and of course, the third set of axiom, which are continuity axiom, weak monotony axiom, minimal transfer axiom, which are actually is going to remain the same for the same between the conventional poverty measure and the complementary poverty measure. Because in these axioms, basically the axioms are meant for only the people who are below the poverty line. In that sense, those axioms would be still valid for the complementary poverty measure. The weak transfer axiom, the weak transfer sensitivity axiom, normalization. Of course, normalization has to be valid in both the measure, because the poverty measure should be, whether it is complementary or conventional, it should be normalized in the sense it should have a min-max value. The minimum should be saying that no poverty or the zero poverty, whereas one is actually full poverty, or all the population, or in case of all the poor people are at the highest level of poverty. So in that sense, a normalization should be valuable. So if we see, what is the implication of this? If we compare two, common measures of poverty, one is income gap ratio and another is poverty gap ratio. This is again, it is quite surprising to, see the names. See, income gap ratio is a ratio meant for the poverty gaps of the poor people, but it is quite strangely named as income gap ratio. Whereas poverty gap ratio actually talks about non-poor also, with a zero contribution from the non-poor. So it is applicable for the entire population, but it is called as poverty gap ratio. Actually, I believe it should have been named reversely. Income gap ratio should have been named as poverty gap ratio, and poverty gap ratio should have been named as income gap ratio. But nevertheless, unfortunately, our approach to substitute, that substitution approach which I said in the beginning, that our approach to substitute an inferior measure with a superior measure actually branded income gap ratio to be not to be a very good measure, in fact a bad measure. So as we see, because income gap ratio would fail in strong monotonicity and non-poverty growth. There is an axiom called non-poverty growth, which will basically say, says if a non-poor joins the society, the poverty value should fall. Of course, income gap ratio, which is basically in the numerator, they are taking the sum of the poverty gap of the poor people, and the denominator is the total number of poor. That has nothing to do with, if non-poor migrating in or out of the society. So in that sense, income gap ratio doesn't change and should not change when a non-poor joins or leaves the society. But since it doesn't change, it is basically said that it doesn't satisfy the non-poverty growth axiom. Similarly, the strong monotonicity axiom, actually this we have already discussed while we were discussing the first set of axioms. If a relatively rich among the poor becomes non-poor, obviously the poverty, the left out people's poverty situation would worsen. That's what income gap ratio would capture. But since income gap ratio is picked as a substitute measure for poverty for the entire population, it is said that income gap ratio is not a good measure, because here when the income of the poor is increasing and that person is becoming non-poor, the poverty situation is worsening. So that is how it is non-commonsensical to believe that. But then this is happening because we are in the attempt of substitution, and we are using the same template for all the measures. So the failure of IGR, that income gap ratio as perceived, is actually misplaced. So so if we want to sort of go further in terms of, for example, the poverty gap ratio, which is basically the headcount ratio, is a crudest measure, we say, because it basically doesn't differentiate between the level of poverty of the poor. The poverty gap ratio would basically capture the depth of the poverty. And if you want to capture the distribution, or you want to become sensitive whether the if 10 unit is the poverty line, one person is at 9 unit, and one person is at 1 unit, vis-a-vis both of them are at 5 units. So poverty gap ratio would give the same value here. But if you want to capture the distribution effect, you basically make it the squared poverty gap. So what I'm trying to say is, poverty gap ratio, squared poverty gap ratio, or if you go more advanced, that is actually our natural substitute to SCR. So SCR, headcount ratio, is a crude measure which is giving a score of 1 to all the poor irrespective of the level of poverty, whereas PGR and SPGR are giving fractional score depending upon how far the people are from the poverty line. In that sense, it is substituting, it is making the HCR fine-tuned. But if you talk of IGR, that income gap ratio, which is giving the level of the poverty of the poor only, is actually a natural complement. In that sense, the set of axioms which you proposed for the IGR, actually most of the axioms would be satisfied by IGR, income gap ratio, and of course the distribution sensitive level kind of axiom would not be satisfied, because when we make it square of IGR, so instead of taking only the distance from the poverty line, if we take the square of the distance and go like for the square of PGR, we'll do square of IGR, which we call as SIGR. So SIGR would be again satisfying the properties in better way. So SIGR actually substitute IGR, but both SIGR and IGR are complements of HCR. So that is the moot point we are trying to put. And if you want to just look at the data, how does it play? If suppose in this table, if you look at the first two countries, India and Chile, as you can see, Chile has only 1.3% of the people who are poor, whereas India has 21.5% people who are poor. I mean, so that's the level of the poverty in terms of the how much proportion of the population are poor. But if we say how much poor the poor are, I mean, so if you want to measure that through PGR, it is a wrong way to measure it, because in PGR, since there are 98 to 99% people who are non-poor in Chile, so they are also appearing in the calculation of PGR in terms of the denominator, because that is basically the denominator is the entire population. So thereby the level of the poverty of the poor gets diluted in the poverty gap ratio, and that's how the poverty gap ratio will be always bounded by HCR. So the maximum value of poverty gap ratio would be the HCR value. Whereas if you talk about the income gap ratio, which is basically talking about the level of poverty of the poor, that is never bounded by HCR, because it is independently showing how much poor the poor are. So in that sense, as you can see, if you would have gone for IGR reporting, then the Chile's case, as you can see, this is the poverty level in terms of IGR is more than in the case of India, which thereby we can say a Chilean poor is poorer than an average Indian poor. An average Chilean poor is poorer than an average Indian poor. But that won't be get reflected if you talk of PGR, which actually in PGR case, the poverty level of the poor are diluted by the presence of non-poor. So poverty of the poor actually hides behind the larger proportion of non-poor. Same goes with South Africa and Lithuania. As you can see, I mean, Lithuania has 0.9% people who are poor, and obviously the PGR value, irrespective of how much poor they may be, the PGR value will never cross the HCR value. But if you actually go for the IGR value, which is actually reflecting, though there are very less people in Lithuania are poor, they are at an extreme poor condition, in the sense they may be homeless, they may be living a very pathetic life. Whereas in South Africa, for example, 16% people are poor, but it is more or less the average South African poor is actually less poor compared to an average Lithuanian poor. So this is what, if we actually promote IGR as a complementary indicator and put side by side to PGR or HCR. I mean, these HCR and PGR are substitutes. So when we actually in the World Bank reports, etc., as well as in the Sustainable Development Goals indicators, we are having both HCR and PGR. I think it is not fair. I mean, you can have both, but then you should have IGR, or if you want to have one of these, you can have one of these and then IGR, because IGR is the one which complements the conventional measure of HCR and PGR. So this is my last slide. So we basically, here basically we sort of summarizing the presentation. We can say that we said that HCR has remained. I mean, irrespective of the fact that HCR has certain limitations, certain kind of serious limitations in terms of poverty measure, but it remained as a headline indicator. And of course, there are three reasons for this. It's simplest, it is the simplest measure. It's the first measure. It's a straightforward measure. And people talk about HCR when they talk about identifying poor. Who is poor, that becomes more important. But I think that the third region here, which is mentioned, like identification of poor is more important than aggregation of poverty. Again, I think this is again a misplaced thing, because both can be done. I mean, it is not that you have to do this or that. So so what we sort of proposed is a two sets of indicators. So we are saying the approach of substituting an inferior indicator with a superior indicator is fallacious. So thereby actually we are not sort of discovering the natural complementarity among the indicators. So we should go for the in the conventional measure of poverty, which would be for the entire population, whereas the complementary set of measures of poverty would be applicable for only the poor people. So in that sense, we can say the complementary sort of measures are basically indicating that how much poor the poor are. The conventional set is basically talking about what is the level of poverty in the entire population, whereas focusing on only on the poor people, the complementary measures is saying how much poor the poor are. So that's what we are trying to say in development reports. IGR is a better candidate to complement HCR, hence should replace PGR. And we are basically trying to advocate that poverty of the poor must not hide, as we saw in the case of Lithuania and Chile. The poverty of the poor were hiding behind the large number of non-poor. So if we put up IGR and we sort of put up as an indicator in the global reports, then it that can incentivize the programs to attack on the poverty in a more effective way. Thank you very much. This is end of my presentation. My email IDs are here, and you are most welcome to contact me on any clarification or any suggestion. And if you are coming by any chance to India, you are most welcome to my institute. My institute has a unique reputation in our country. In fact, it is the #1 institute in the sector of rural management, and this institute was founded by none other than, we call him the milkman of India, or the father of white revolution, Dr. Verghese Kurian. So this Institute of Rural Management, in the modest town of Anand, is actually a pristine campus, a green campus, and a beautiful campus. So all of you are most welcome to contact me, and whenever you are in India, you are welcome, most welcome to our campus. Thank you very much.